Hey everyone, what's going on? This is Casual TF2. We're gonna do a video right now. You ready? So, before we get into everything I'm gonna talk about, I have two quick announcements for you. So the first thing is that I have a pub TF2 server now. So I'm gonna post the IP on the screen here. Please add this IP into your favorites tab in your server browser in TF2. Also check the description if the IP is out of date or something. But hopefully I'll see you on there sometime. I'll try to be on there here and there. I know a lot of my people in my community have been playing on there, which is great. Right now it is 24/7 bad water, and it includes a few sort of subtle item reverts. So for example, the ambassador, it behaves like the old ambassador where you can actually get long range satisfying headshots on spies, so check that out. The second thing is that I have a Discord server, which you may or may not know about, where I host private TF2 games every week, every Saturday. And I also hang out in voice chat from time to time. People are social there. And so I always include a temporary invite link to that server in the description of a new video. But just letting you know, if you want to befriend some other weirdos or you want some scheduled gaming, please hop in that server. So let's get into it now. Let's talk about stuff, because I have a lot I want to say. Pewdiepie moved to Japan, first of all. And that has a lot to do with how busy my life's been, really, and particularly busy socially. Because lately, I'm so busy, I'm having these moments of reflection where I realize, man, I've been talking all day, right? I've been using my mouth to speak all day, because in my professional life, my job has me talking all day, and then outside of work hours, I'm finding time to catch up with people that I live with, and a few times a week, you add on some social plans in real life. You add on trying to be social with people from my Discord server, and you join that VC. And then you got your parents calling you, trying to catch up, And I have so many people that I'm connected to in this world. And I feel very blessed for that. I feel super blessed for that. Because in one sense, I consider conversation with others to be the ultimate currency of our animal world. And so as a younger person, I was more individualistic and kind of in a slightly spiteful way, and that I thought I could do everything on my own, and I was more picky about who I associated with. And for the most part, I think that strategy is fair, because you can still get a ton done in life by yourself and just avoiding other people if you want. But being social is necessary for your well-being. It's necessary for your personal health as well. And so maybe you're some genius computer programmer and you make your living writing software or something. You do everything by yourself. You write your software, you sell your software, you don't have to interact with anyone else. People have a demand for it, so they want to buy it. You don't have to advertise it. You're totally self-employed. And so as far as immediate survival is concerned in the modern world, that person, that programmer, doesn't need anything else. They don't need anyone else socially to survive. They don't need social interaction on that most basic level. But just above that most basic level of survival, on the stage above that, everyone needs social interaction, that programmer included. It's just part of our nature. Babies die if they don't receive human touch. We are animals, and some part of that is just unavoidable. That's we're literally animals, guys. Kind of crazy. And that's a theme I'm going to touch on sort of throughout this long rant. Not being able to escape our animal nature. And so I'm talking about being socialized and all that, because I think that that's actually one of the best metrics we have for health, is how socialized you are, how much interaction you're doing. Does a person behave antisocially, or do they behave pro-socially? And so to be antisocial doesn't mean that you're a loner, right? If you're a loner who doesn't hang out with people, that's being asocial, right? Asocial, an absence of interacting with people. But antisocial, that's really a description of how you interact with people. Being antisocial is a type of interacting with people that is a bit more dismissive and off, I guess you could say. There's a lot of good reasons to behave antisocially, and those reasons include all the ways that people have cheated you in your life and spat on you in previous social situations. And so because those things have happened, you learn and say, I'm going to be ultra cautious, I'm going to be standoffish in interacting with other people, that way I don't get hurt, which is reasonable. You know, in most cases, antisocial behavior is just an adaptation to those circumstances that you had to deal with in your life. And so people with trust issues, I would say, aren't just magically born with trust issues. I would say that their trust issues were a strategy to survive a previous environment or some sort of repeating scenario where they legitimately couldn't have or shouldn't have trusted someone. So if you find yourself having very antisocial urges, you don't have to crucify yourself for it. I just suggest asking yourself why you have those tendencies. Where did they come from? I mentioned when I was younger, I had some phases of being more individualistic. And part of that for me came from feeling that I wasn't really understood by the people around me. I was being taken advantage of in some social situations. And so I developed a bit more of this I'll handle things myself kind of strategy. And it probably had a lot to do with my parents as well, and that relationship, and how sometimes I decided that it'd be better to hide my problems than bring them up to them, because dealing with their reaction to whatever the problem was more painful than just trying to handle it on my own, even if the problem might have benefited from some adult assistance. So anyway, part of that individuation process for me was developing a higher set of standards with who I interacted with. I started being more discretionary in my social life. You know, I probably was more judgmental of a lot of people, and I decided that most people weren't really worth giving much energy to. And that was because they weren't going to give me what I was looking for in a social interaction. That thing that I was looking for when I was 17 or 18 years old was long, deep conversations about understanding reality and understanding ourselves. And I think I had a bit of bad luck in my life and the way things played out, and that, you know, a lot of the people I happened to be around at that time, they might have liked my vibe overall, and they might have liked having the kind of conversations that I was encouraging, but I was kind of more of a side project to them. That wasn't really a reflection of their main interests. I was more of a side hoe for them. And so there were a few experiences with certain people that now I just say was outright bad luck, wrong place, wrong time, where other people were dealing with own things in their own lives that put our friendship on the back burner. But those things made me nonetheless bitter, you know, about people in general. Even if it was luck or bad luck, it was hard for me to see at the time. And you get a little cynical, you get a little hurt by that. You know, even if the world is a beautiful place, if you live in an ugly sewer, you're going to start to believe that the whole world is an ugly sewer. And that's not an unreasonable suspicion to have based on that data that you've been given. So sometimes we're definitely tested by our circumstances in life. But the funny thing about how I turned out, in spite of those experiences, is now I really relish in the most shallow, basic social interactions. You know, I'm the guy who wants to talk to the teller or the clerk at the grocery. I want to make friends with the postman. And I've always had a bit of that in me, you know, that positive social vibe. But now I'm really like actively trying to encourage it. Now I see it as something I want to nurture. And part of that mentality I try to have is acting like there's something useful that I could get from anyone. But like actually trying to believe that and actually believing it, because it might not be that thing that you get from someone is the secret wisdom of how the universe works, right? It might just be a smile, and it might just be something that makes you laugh. And maybe it might be a lesson about how stupid they are or how stupid people can be. But every social interaction has the potential to be a learning opportunity. And it's also a significant opportunity not just to get things from them, but to form yourself. Because we are made real by interacting with others. And in that same way, others are made real by us. And it sounds like hokey-fogey, new age type stuff, but when you have people like Alan Watts say there is no self without other, that actually really holds up quite well in the practical real world, because we are defined by our own personal interests and persuasions, But the whole thing is social. The whole world is social. It's all relative to other people. You know, all of this that we're experiencing it right now, none of this can be existent without people interacting. Economies are literally just exchanges of services between people, and civilizations are really just the biggest collaboration project of all time. You know, everything comes down to some form of cooperation. That's how we got here as a species. And interactions permeate every part of that very complex machine. And of course, you know, you listening would not exist without the symbiosis and cooperation of two people. That's why you were born, because of two people choosing to do something together. You are a collab. You are a collab. Everything is a collab here in this world. And, well, we do live in a world that is very modern and futuristic, and we now are able to be so disconnected from others and still survive, which is a miracle. We can live alone in our apartments, we can work from home, ignore our families, you can order food to be delivered to your door. That's just all this big dream, this big fantasy, to think that that's real, you know? That's just the byproduct of a lot of social cooperation, because you wouldn't be able to live alone in a modern urban landscape being delivered food without the system that was constructed by immense social cooperation. Because even if it seems like it, you know, you can really shut things out, no one is self-sufficient in this world. Even the most extreme cases aren't self-sufficient, you know? Even some dude living out there in the wilderness, living off their own farms and they're hunting, they still depend on other people, you know? People work in tribes, even the most primitive human beings. And so, I'm not trying to make my own rule set about life. That's how I feel I'm going about things. That's how I think I'm going about things. I'm trying to just extract what's already there, what makes sense, right? I'm not trying to construct some big new approach to things. I think I'm just trying to be pragmatic and be realistic about what the hell this situation is that I'm in, right? I was born here, as are you, so I'm here, and I don't think I chose that. And this world and all of its oddities, I don't feel responsible for that at all, but what choice do I have? Right? I'm here, the world seems to be social, seems to depend on that to exist, so what am I going to do? You know, I really see it that everything leads to one of two paths. If you really narrow down what each action, what each event leads us closer towards. And so one path is the path of creating life, creating joy, of fun and merriment and all that sort of stuff. And that other path is the opposite. It's of creating death and creating suffering. And it sounds extreme, but every action, you could say, contributes towards one of those two outcomes. And, you know, you don't have to nitpick so super hard about this, right? Because there are things that are a mixture of both. You know, for example, eating food, that gives us life, right? But it also is a process, digestion, that ages us. And so some aspects of the food we eat may be bad for us, but at the same time, what are you going to do? Are you going to stop eating because it's not 100% towards the path of life? It's like, no, there's some level of realisticness you need to have, and just sort of aim. For me, I'm just aiming net for one of those paths, you know, and you do your best to sort of make good judgments about how your actions are actually pushing you in one way or another. You know, our culture, our current culture, kind of glorifies the doomer, the person who suffers tremendously, the martyr. And when you're really a martyr, true martyrdom is having no choice. True martyrdom is when people nail you to a cross, when your hometown is bombed, right? That's being a martyr. But for the rest of us, unless you're in a situation like that, really, we have so much choice in the direction that we lead our lives. And so it can be satisfying to watch something with these sort of doomery tones like Taxi Driver and think, man, I know what it feels like to feel that and feel that the world is so fucked and cold. And there's truth to that. And I also don't think we need to hide from that aspect of reality and what that, media like that shows. But how long, that's the question, how long do we relish in acknowledging that things are fucked? Because some people spend their whole life doing that. They just bitch about how fucked things are forever. And there's even people who, they might not say a word, they might not, speak those utterances of complaining, but they behave in a way that conveys that that's where they're seeing things at. And there are times that we need to dwell on all the shit that has gone wrong, but always, at some point, you can only dwell so long, and again, you have to be practical, because the time keeps going. We can't just hit pause. You're still here. This world is still spinning. And you literally don't have forever to dwell on the shit that's gone wrong, because you won't be alive forever. Right? You're watching this video right now at some certain time, on some certain day, and you're never going to get this moment back. This moment right now I'm talking to you, we can't get this back. You will never live this again. You can watch this video again later, but it won't be this moment. It will never be as it is right now. You will never receive this message as you're receiving it right now. You're never going to experience things exactly as they are in this moment. Your time right now is precious. And if you really hate, being alive that bad, and you want to watch the world burn and want to quit, then be consistent with that. I don't think personally that anyone should commit suicide. But if someone chooses to end their own life and they write some big manifesto about how they really don't want to be here, I would say that's a tragedy. It is a tragedy, but hey, they acted in accordance with their beliefs. And I respect that consistency more than I respect people who just mope and bitch and cause themselves all kinds of needless suffering, but then they're unwilling to do anything about it, good or bad. You know what I mean? They're not willing to really sink with their ship or to fix their ship, but they just want to keep talking about it. You hate your life? Well, make it better. And if you don't want to make it better, then you can end your life. And, I will argue strongly against that choice. I don't think you have to end your life. I don't think it's necessary in most cases. But you also should start being realistic about what you're doing. Because people die. And you're going to die. So how do you want to spend your time before you die? You don't have to think it's fair that you're alive. That's not my pitch here. But again, I'm saying be realistic about it. Are you going to spend your time here throwing a temper tantrum about the fact that you're here when you could just as easily smell the flowers before it all ends, right? And I bring all that up just as a reminder that we don't have any choice regarding the circumstances we're brought up into. But we have a choice with what we're going to do regardless of that. And my whole worldview, all this spiel about being pro-social, it's just about being realistic. If you think you have a better solution for how to respond to the fact that we've been thrown into this reality that is the way it is, you can argue that with me. You can say which way you think is better. But the reason I believe what I believe, the reason I have conviction about it, is because I'm also familiar with the alternatives. And the alternatives really make me realize, what the hell else are you going to do? What do you really gain from avoiding conversation with the teller at the supermarket? What do you really gain from not sharing yourself with the people around you? And at the best, you probably gain short-term comforts that will ultimately result in long-term disasters. It's the classic dilemma of I'm afraid to tell my friend about X, Y, and Z. But if they really stop being your friend because of X, Y, and Z, then you guys probably aren't a good fit as friends. And so just hiding X, Y, Z in the closet and thinking you can avoid that forever, it's just sustaining a relationship that might really be incompatible, or at the least it could be certainly replaced by a better relationship for both of you. And I think if you consider this, and if you already are this way, if you're practical about how things are, you know that it's just such a freaking like relief, There's you can sort of take a breath because of this, because I think a lot of Gen Z people have the first part down. They have an easy time being practical about how fucked the world is, but they don't really have a practical approach about what they're going to do within that. And that's kind of where the story ends for a lot of people. It's like, oh man, things are screwed up, there's a lot of problems. Okay? And, you're not the world. You're you. So what do you want to do here? How do you want your time to be spent? What are your values? What are your freaking values, man? When I was younger, I remember values and virtues just seeming like these abstract concepts. And I understood generally what they were about. I understood that virtues was like a sum category of these certain types of words that had a similar idea, like courage or honesty. But I didn't really get why those things were important, like why people placed emphasis on these virtues. And maybe I did understand why they were important, but I didn't understand the necessity of them. And so, when we talk about virtues, have you ever thought about curiosity, or why curiosity might matter? I'd say it's really useful to spend some time thinking about this. Because with all these things, you gotta think it through. You have to be curious about curiosity. And so life is a connected system. So you have to ask what purpose curiosity will serve in the context of whatever's around it. So people love to make, very absolute statements about things like X is good, Y is bad, very black and white. But here's the thing, I'm not even gonna take a black or white approach about black and white thinking, because black and white thinking can be appropriate sometimes, and it can also be inappropriate in other times. And so the biggest personal grievance I have with black and white thinking is that I think a lot of people use it as a crutch to stop being curious. It lets them stop having to engage in a curious investigation about things. Because if you instantly decide whether something's useful or not, if you instantly decide that it's true or that it's false, that saves you energy from having to poke around and investigate and continue being curious. And that's great from a energy conservation standpoint. But our feeble monkey mind plans about energy conservation are also not strictly good within themselves, which is back to my main idea that most things are not strictly good by themselves. Curiosity for the sake of curiosity, unlimited curiosity is not necessarily always a good thing. It depends on the context. And energy conservation, while an excellent strategy in some situations, that could cause you problems. You might bite yourself in the ass by being that way in other situations. So the classic example is where they ask the kid if you want one cookie now or do you want 2 cookies later. And while that is literally a weird hypothetical situation, right? It's very like, oh, that's supernatural, right? Some weird cookie game show thing. But you can also think of it like this. How about, how much energy do we conserve now by living in our air-conditioned houses and getting our food from groceries? We conserve a lot of energy by being able to live like that, by not having to be weathered by nature and get all of our own food. But the thing is, we were only able to get to this point by building civilization and advancing technology, and those things took a fuck ton of effort expenditure. Do you want to know what complete energy conservation looks like? That's your only strategy? All you gotta do is look at what most other animals in the animal kingdom have accomplished. Where are their skyscrapers? Where's their great artwork? Because humans were so kick-ass that because we could abstract enough to understand that some seemingly unnecessary effort now could mean less effort later, that's what made us different, And some of that intelligence isn't all life. I'm not saying it's all black and white, pun. I don't know if that's a pun, you get the idea. But squirrels, for example, they know how to bury their nuts for winter and all that, right? But again, where are the squirrel skyscrapers? Where's their air conditioning? Right? They've got some of it, but maybe not enough. So it's strange how sometimes in life to ultimately conserve the most energy in the grand scheme of things. Let's say if your goal was to retire at age 40, you'd probably have to expend a fuck ton of energy before the age of 40 to do that. So in the long term, the ultimate energy conservation strategy might be to not conserve energy. Right? But it all depends. It all depends on the details. So if there's anything you're going to take away from this first ramble, it's just to remember that there's a lot more gained from staying open-minded about things rather than being quickly decided. You want to think quantum, right? Let things be in a superposition of undecidedness and just keep collecting data. Because when you need to make a decision, right, when you have a practical scenario where you need to decide what you're going to do, then you can make an educated guess of what would be best to do based on all the data you have, right? But you don't need to make your decision before you have a situation where you need it. And a lot of people do that and then they stop collecting data. So please don't stop collecting data, because that's the mistake a lot of people fall victim to, is that they will write off an entire system of thinking. They'll write off all the things that one person says, and often this is because what other things say are an affront to the way that they usually make their choices. But what it all does is it stops them from genuinely considering things that might oppose their views. And you got to ask, why even do that? Well, the reason you would consider things that oppose your views is, what if your views don't serve you? Right? What if you were sold on bad views? What if you were sold on bad ideas? And so what if you find out that the mentality you thought was helping you was actually hurting you? And to even get there, the first step is you have to be open to that even being a possibility. And to me, that's the essence of being willing to grow. That's what growing is about. And when we're children, we do a lot of it, and that's largely because we don't have a choice. You have to grow. As a child, you're in an adult world. You're not in a child world. And so because you're the odd one out, you're constantly learning better ways to do things, and you have to make mistakes all the time. You're being ushered into this society of adults who literally are more equipped than you in almost every way. They've got the strats figured out. It's like you show up in the TF2 with 10 hours and you're playing against all these people with thousands of hours. You're just getting dunked on constantly. And so you might try out all kinds of strategies. You're experimenting. You're sitting idly by your dispenser and you're hitting it with a wrench. And adults will look at you and they'll be like, oh, isn't that cute? Because they can wreck you without hesitation because they know better strategies. And so you'll learn all those strategies from the adults. You'll learn the better ways to do things. But as we get older, as we become a 1,000+ hour player ourselves, we often get a bit more calcified. We get set in stone about how we have to do things. Because when we're a baby, you're so fucking helpless that it's literally your parents' way or the highway. So you start adapting to do things their way, right? You don't have a choice. No one has a choice to start learning English or whatever their native tongue is as a baby. Your parents just use that shit and they're like, my way or the highway, baby. We're just gonna use English until you figure it out, okay? Because that's how it works here in adult world. And so no baby is principled enough or capable enough to go, no, I refuse, I'm not gonna learn English. I'm not gonna do that to correspond with you. Right? But as people grow up from being babies, they become capable of that kind of principled reasoning. They become more likely to say, no, I refuse. I will not learn. I will not challenge myself. I will not try your way of doing things. And so I would ask, for what reason do we have to be like that? There's of course going to be times when people give you awful advice and maybe they aren't worth really respecting or taking advice from anyway because they lead their own life terribly, right? That's a good indicator. But for the rest of situations, we probably just get lazy and we just kind of figure that functioning enough at an okay level is good, right? We don't have to change much or try new stuff if we just overall are doing okay. And you can make an argument that there's a bit of stubbornness in the human condition, but I would say at the very least, laziness sure is. Again, we have a bit of that energy conservation, desire within us because we are animals. But even as adults who now have this choice, right? whether we're going to learn that language to appease our parents and effectively work with them, what's so wrong about expanding our tool set and continuing to grow as adults? And I think that's what separates the TF2 player that has 7,000 hours, who's, good at the game, from the TF2 players who have 7,000 hours and are objectively one of the best TF2 players ever. Because the very most talented TF2 players, the very most talented people from any field, those are the people who keep studying, who keep grinding, who keep growing, because their learning process didn't end once they achieved that basic fluency in the game, right? It wasn't like, they finally got to that point that they could top score in a pub, and then, now they kind of change their attitude, right? They kept going. They kept trying to learn and kept improving, kept wanting to be better, kept being curious about new approaches. Unfortunately, a lot of people stop continuing to have that hunger for knowledge and improvement that they once did once they reach that level of basic competency, right? Which is similar to what babies do. And on some level, you gotta say, to each their own. If TF2 or any kind of hobby is something you just want to sort of turn your brain off to relax, that's fine. After a long week, you just want to have your casual pastime and it's not a huge deal. That's okay, right? Not every single action in our life needs to be ultra optimized and ultra everything must grow, right? We can just chill out and really unwind sometimes. You're not committing some moral sin by not choosing to constantly improve and challenge yourself to be the very best TF2 player ever. But it's good to remind ourselves that much of the fun in life, the true joy about being here, comes from having challenges that we can overcome, and you rise to that challenge and then you grow and you improve. That's a lot of times what makes life enjoyable. That's maybe why some people look fondly on those early hours in a game, or fondly on their childhood, was because they actually had a ton of challenges around them all the time. So yeah, that's my shtick. I respect those who grind, I really respect those who study. I love people who keep trying to rise to those challenges of life, and they do their best no matter what, no matter how stacked the odds seem against them. Because they don't have to. That's a big part of why I respect it. And most people, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people choose not to. And so TF2, for me, that's not been my craft that I'm trying to improve at for quite a while now. It's really more of like a background focus in my life. Even when I play now, the things I'm trying to focus on in TF2, I'm trying to improve my communication. It's a different thing I'm thinking about. But I do have those parts of my life that I am super excited to excel at. I'm hungry to keep getting better at. I'm hungry to keep studying. When we're forced by our circumstances to grow, it can be uncomfortable, right? Because it sucks to feel like we don't have a choice about it. But what if it also can be sort of nice to embrace that we don't have much of a choice about it, even when we aren't forced to, right? Because it can be quite pleasant to discover that maybe growing is the best thing we can do in life. It's back to this idea of what the hell else are you going to do here? You really hate growing? You really hate learning and becoming a better person? Well, what are you going to do instead? You're going to be stagnant? You're like, yeah, I want to be stagnant. I want to be lifeless. I want to be disinterested in my own quality of being. I mean, does that sound better? Because if you're not putting energy into life, if you're not trying to make it better, you can count on it getting worse. Or at the very least, it's just going to offer you a sort of very gentle taste of nothing, a numbness, right? So I like people who study, and I like people who go to community college. I speak super highly of community college, a place of studying, And for me, when I was finished with high school, or not really finished with high school, but at the end of high school, I was in this program that let me go to community college. I could take some classes, and through that, I ended up getting an associate's degree. In community college, I had no idea what to expect. It was such a fucking awesome vibe, because you've got some of your young people that you normally expect who really have no idea what they're doing. They're just 18, 19-year-olds, and some of us also feel like they're coasting by, right, by going to community college. They feel like they're taking the easy way out. But the best part is that you've got all these old people, and they're the better old people. They're not the boring old people, because they're the old people that chose to go back to school. They're the old people that decided to reinvest in their education. They decided to change their career. They wanted to increase their qualifications. And a lot of them just want to learn for the sake of learning. There's people who are just there to learn. And I can tell you, as someone who was 16 at my youngest when I attended some of these community college classes, even having a small handful of those people in the room, those cool old people, it totally changed the vibe. It totally changed the atmosphere. Even just having like 2 or 3 in a class of 50. Because you're used to hanging around a bunch of insecure teenagers when you're at that age. You're used to being with people who are battling with their own troubled self-understanding. They're constantly cracking jokes. And so when you have some 50-year-old dude, right, they show up to the class on time, they take diligent notes, they ask questions, they have this aura of confidence that you only get from being alive for a long time, and they'll casually share these personal anecdotes about their 30 years of work experience in construction or whatever it is. And those kinds of people are so much cooler than any college kid could be. Because even if the younger people in the class didn't actively think a thought like that, even if they weren't like, oh man, these old people are so cool, those older people really demanded respect from you in a different way than your average 20-year-old would demand respect from you. And why is that? Well, in spite of how much you as a young person are probably eager to fuck off and get out of school and get on with your own life and finally live all those hyped up fantasies you've had since a child about you can now have the perks of being an adult and living on your own and all this sort of stuff. Here you have an adult, someone who's lived all those things you fantasized about already, and they've got the choice to continue living that way in the adult world, but then they come back to school by their own volition. And I think of this like they're a level 2 reincarnated being, right? Because all the normal college-aged kids, they're on their first life. They haven't reincarnated yet. And what the hell? You don't expect this. There's all these people here who've already lived a life. There's level 2 reincarnated people here. Well, that there are at community college. There's people who choose to come back and be in that same classroom that they were a lifetime ago. And it's a very subtle message, but I found in a lot of the older people that I met at community college, they had their head on a bit more straight than the average Joe. It's a subtle thing, but you could tell. And it's easier to give flack to these kind of people because you say, these are the fuck-ups. They've had crappy jobs for 25 years, and just now they're fixing it. It's over for them. These people, they've wasted their youth, blah, blah, blah. But you got to remember, regardless of how much or how severe the mistakes that they've made in their life were, and how many zigzags they've taken down different paths, these are the people who chose to be proactive and actually do something about it. Because it's not like everyone's going back to community college. It's not like that's the norm. It makes me think how society has this idea of the midlife crisis. And it's painted as this bad thing. It's embarrassing. It's something you should be worried about happening to you, because then you'll be the butt of someone else's joke. It's like, wait a minute, you started taking a language class at 50 years old? Must be a midlife crisis. You started investing a bunch of your money into some new hobby that you've never been into? Sounds like a midlife crisis. But you know what? This is what I'll say. I say props to those people. Props to the people who have a midlife crisis. Because there's actually a lot of people who never have it. Plenty of people die in that same place that they were born. They work that same job for 50 years. They watch TV 3 hours a night for most of it and spend half their life in a sedative state. They never question where the hell they were going. And don't get me wrong, there's no issue with living a wholesome, traditional, simple life, working one job that you like, spending your time in the same home with your same family all the time. But the thing is, that sort of portrait of a life, some people live that life and they do those things not out of joy, but out of laziness to do anything else. And in the worst case scenario, sometimes they do it even though they hate their job, or even though their family is in disarray, and there's all kinds of dysfunctional behavior going on. They just stay there in that semi-shitty situation, and they continue checking out because every year that goes by, they just get more and more used to things, regardless of how bad they might be. So shout out to the people who have their midlife crisis, because that tells me they at least haven't fallen asleep at that wheel, right? Their sensor went off and they had a moment of healthy panic and they asked themselves, where the hell is this all going? And so they try new things. They try exploring to sort of understand that thread further. And this ties into another bigger facet of our culture that I'm not a huge fan of, which is that we seem to be very critical of people messing up, of people taking mistakes, of failure. And so a lot of us get a little bit of this mindset of it being better to not fail at all and play it a bit safe than to try and mess up in front of people. And so many of us play this way, and it gets drilled into us by our family, our peers growing up. You're gonna get teased if you make a mistake, if you fuck up, if you're embarrassed by not knowing what you're doing. And so slowly, life sort of conditions us to conform and teach us, hey, don't step out of line in a way that's gonna bring unfriendly attention to you. But a lot of times that unfriendly attention isn't deserved. And so even sometimes this can horseshoe around, this can work in the totally opposite way, where for some they're so deprived of attention in their childhood that making mistakes and being a failure, breaking the rules, that becomes their social strategy of choice, because that's the only way that they're able to get that attention that they were deprived of. And I notice if you talk to older people, if you talk to your parents, if you talk to your friends' parents, your parents' friends, you're gonna find they have a lot of the same stories about, or I should say a lot of the same opinion about how our generation is much more risk averse than our parents' generation was. And that's probably the byproduct of a lot of different things. There's probably a whole spread of generational changes that have happened. But it's interesting that if you're Gen Z, you probably had this sort of newer era of helicopter-y parents. And even if not for that, you've been coddled by the friendly, always available touch of the digital world, of the internet. And so on paper, things might have been easy for us, but that's also why it's been so hard for us, right? Having that always available internet to be cozy with us, right? Not having to be bored as much as our parents' generation might have. And so I kind of want to die on this hill of this particular message that I think is important for young people my age, and even more for young people my age who are kind of in this demographic of generally young males who played a lot of computer games and they've got a bit more intellectual aptitude. To those people, I want to say, I want you to break the mold a little bit, to kind of take some more risks, to introduce some more variety into our life, because I think that's what that sort of demographic tends to be missing. And it's counterintuitive, because oftentimes the people who are most concerned about a particular thing should also be the least concerned about it. So a lot of the people who are very risk averse, I would say they need to be less risk averse, and they would say that's probably crazy, because after all, they're quite risk averse. And so there's always going to be exception cases, but I've found pretty consistently, and this goes for all kinds of different personality traits, that like let's say, people who tend to be overly concerned with how their actions might affect others, I think those people tend to cause themselves a lot of unnecessary suffering by being so super concerned. Because sometimes they will imply what happened from a situation, they'll imply too much of how other people might have been affected without actually hearing it straight from them. And so those people who are actually very socially self-conscious are the same people who are constantly worrying that they are not self-conscious enough. And then, ironically, on the flip side, you have the people who are completely socially inept and they're unaware of how they're affecting other people. They cause problems everywhere they go with others. And they're often the people who are oblivious. They're the people that never think about how they might be affecting others. It's this weird thing, Bodybuilders, they also have higher rates of body dysmorphia, right? They're They have more of an issue of thinking they're not jacked than people who literally aren't jacked. The people who are already bigger think they aren't big enough. You have the anorexics, they think they're not skinny enough. And then you have the socially conscious people, the overly socially conscious people, and they think they're not socially conscious enough. And then you have the risk-averse people who are overly concerned with being too risky. And then, of course, you have the reckless people that are oblivious to how reckless they are in a lot of situations. Like I said at the very beginning here, I've been more busy lately. And because I've been more busy lately, I catch myself sort of immediately wondering what I can do with my free time once I have that free time. It'll be like, oh, at last, here's my unscheduled time, because I've been so scheduled. And then the thing is, once I have that free time, I'll immediately want to fill it with something, which in turn makes it scheduled, makes it not free, right? So, and this finally just struck me for how odd it is, right? Why do we savor this free time if we're just going to quickly make it not free time? And we're just going to immediately dedicate a time period to now have a task. And on one hand, this is harmless, right? This is just enjoyment of life. It means there's a lot you want to do. But at the same time, I wonder if we always fill our free time with tasks, we're never going to have what is truly free time. And free time has more value in and of itself than just being a sort of like fill-in-the-blank space on your calendar. And so I'm going to argue in favor of not treating it like a fill-in-the-blank space, but really treating it like it truly needs to be a blank space. And this makes me think of David Lynch, because I remember David Lynch talking about how one of his big inspirations for getting creative information is to have the ability to just sit and do nothing and just let stuff come to you. And this is, interestingly, even considered a classification of meditation in some circles, right? So you might have body scanning, vipassana meditation, you have transcendental meditation, and then there's just straight up do nothing meditation, where that's the aim, is to just do nothing. And so David Lynch talked about liking silence because when you let there be silence that you don't fill consciously, it often is filled unconsciously and in the most unexpected ways. So what I'm interested by is the idea of, rather than having to decide what will come of our free time, just let it be free and see what happens. Lean into doing nothing. Just lie down, close your eyes, sit somewhere, see what happens. Because whatever you experience will probably be in stark contrast to how you live the rest of your life, right? Instead of always choosing what's next, always choosing how to fill in the blanks, you're just gonna let it happen. And here, when you have that true free time, and that true unscheduled time, you can let the blanks fill in you. And so the more I've been thinking about this typical conception we have about scheduled and unscheduled time, I'm realizing an important part might be the aspect of control. Because I think a lot of people live in this paradigm where you have scheduled time that you maybe don't always control what happens during it, and then you have unscheduled time that you definitely control. Right? So the first category, you've got going to work, going to school, these other kind of responsibilities where you might feel a bit more like a cog in the machine. You might not always have say or power as to what you're going to be actually doing in those situations in that time. And then on the other hand, you've got your time off, which is that feeling when you get home from school, when the workday finally ends. And so I'd say the eagerness that comes from, oh, hey, great, here's our unscheduled time. I don't think it's so much about the unscheduled aspect of it, but I think it's because we control it. And so that eagerness isn't really from a place of, great, now I can do nothing. People might say that when they get out of work. They might say, great, now I can do nothing. But I think they mean it kind of figuratively, because chances are they'll probably go home and they'll actually play video games, they'll watch movies, they'll talk to their spouse for the rest of the night. They won't actually be doing nothing. And I'll say maybe they should. When we're firmly planted in this dichotomy between my time and then the time that the world has us, we often have this tendency to fill our personal time with anything just because it's satisfying to know that we're the ones responsible for choosing to do that thing. It's because there's a sense of agency that's ours. And sometimes that makes a lot of the difference. And this sort of touches on edges with the idea of that phrase that's something like, don't make a living out of your passion, because then what you love will become work. And I don't think that's a universal truth necessarily, but the truth of that, when it is there, is that the context of what we're doing is really important, right? What we believe to be the purpose, or if we believe we have agency over it or not. You know, are we doing something just because of the money? Or are we doing something just because we chose to for the sake of it? That's a really important distinction. And it might even be the exact same action that we're doing in either one of those contexts, but the context will change the experience of that same action completely. And this is one of those things that's really the strange beauty of how humans are, because we just get the most insane conceptual hard-ons. You know, humans will do things absolutely just because they love the concept of it. They'll be so enamored by this abstract world in their minds that they'll do things that might not make sense when you just look at it isolated. You know, there's the rest of the animal kingdom, and they seem to be more interested in the physical world, I think, compared to humans, who will do a lot of things for the physical world, but also for this abstract world in our minds. You know, there's a human being out there who made a mission to visit, you know, bazillions of Starbucks in their life. I think they've been to 15,000 Starbucks coffee places in their lifetime. And they're trying to see every single one. And so, of course, there's a lot of reasons why practically that would not make sense to a very literal, non-conceptual, very physically based person. Because you'd say, can't you just go to the same Starbucks 15,000 times if you really need that much coffee, right? It seems inefficient to keep moving from place to place if they're all similar. And the appeal of going to every single Starbucks is totally conceptual, right? It's not about the action in and of itself of constantly traveling to a new Starbucks or really what you get intrinsically from Starbucks. Because that could be seen as torture to someone else, depending on the context, right? And this is where we get to the idea that for one man, it's heaven on earth, but for another man, you know, their trash is trash, someone else's trash is fortune, something like this. And so all I'm saying here is that our mindset behind why we're doing things, or even just why we think we're doing things, right? Who knows why we're really doing things? That greatly affects the quality of that experience. And so this is a lot of elaboration here, but this is all just to re-emphasize that maybe maybe you, maybe we should consider, you know, a new strategy of using our time. Because when we're doing things, when we're filling our time in the day, maybe let's go hard. Let's just do it all. You know, leave no stone unturned. Leave no room for emptiness. No room for nothing. Fully experience doing things. But then, when you reach Sunday and you've scheduled nothing, truly do nothing, right? Resist that urge to go on a big hiking trip, to spend all day on a hobby, or to do whatever you usually do to fill time. Just actually try to do nothing for a little while. You know, meander, sit in the backyard, lose track of time. And I don't really do this enough. I almost never do this, but I'd like to incorporate it more into my life. You know, I'm often finding myself experiencing this strange contradiction where I feel like my life is so busy that time is passing both incredibly slowly and incredibly fast, which I think is a fairly human thing to feel, where last Tuesday feels like it was a year ago, but then last Tuesday feels like it was yesterday. Right? It's a weird paradox. But I really get that way when I am so busy. And it makes me think of something that my friend David says, where he says something along the lines of, you know, there's nothing wrong with being a young person who's very busy and who's just going all the time. And he'd say that what being a young person is supposed to be about is that, you know, going. And when you're old, that's when you have time to stop going, and when you have time to be reflective. That's the time to be reflective. And I appreciate him saying that for a lot of reasons. One is that I appreciate when people have these sort of strong principles or strong suggestions about how one should live or about how life should be. You know, I don't think you should fake them. I don't think you should make things up if you don't really believe them just for the sake of having a strong principle. But if you have that belief in you that you're sure is worth mentioning, then you should mention it. You should stand your ground. You should make an opinion. And earlier in this video, I mentioned how it's important to not think too black or white. Or I guess I should say to not think black and white, right? That it's all one thing or all the other. And that we should keep in mind alternatives. We should keep recording data, even for lines of thinking you might not totally agree with, because sometimes you just need that next piece of data to recontextualize all the data you already have that might not make sense right now, right? But maybe you just need that one next piece to create a coherent image from all the data you already have that right now seems senseless. But the thing is, you don't know that until you have that last piece, and you also don't know what that last piece is, right? You don't know you're missing it until you find it. So stay curious, stay interested. And so I brought that up again in context of this idea of, you know, that I like that my friend David had this thought, is that having a strong thought like that also requires us to have some balance about black and white thinking. Because my whole spiel was about being cautious of it, but black and white thinking is also not always bad. You know, just because we can stay open-minded about things doesn't mean that we shouldn't have an opinion. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have takes. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have strong suggestions or principles or beliefs. And this also connects to the idea of not being afraid to make mistakes. You know, a lot of people experience fear in being experimental with their thinking because they're afraid to try new things. You know, they're afraid to think out loud, to put on different ideas, to talk through things. And they might be afraid to make a strong suggestion, you know, or to follow a clear one direction, one-sided principle if they don't feel 100% sure about it, right? But you're kind of playing a losing game if you're only going to play when you feel 100% sure about something. Because the reason we would use that sort of operational strategy, the reason we would only play when we're 100% sure, that's a strategy you employ to prevent losing, right? That's because you don't want to be making mistakes. You're afraid of making mistakes for whatever reason. And you won't make critical mistakes if you only play when you're 100% sure. But because of that, you're going to make the mistake of not playing enough. You're not playing the game enough. And you're going to lose to the person who went out on a leap and they try things even if they were only 90% sure, because that person who was 90% sure would play a lot more and they'd be able to interact with life in so many more circumstances because of where they set that threshold on how certain they needed to be in order to express something, right? It was just lenient enough that they actually got to interact more with life. And the more you interact with life, the more chances you have to win. It's as simple as that, you know? That's my real, put a pin in that insight from everything I've experienced in my life, is that luck is super real. But you, of course, partially make your luck. And you have to play to win. Those who never play, never win. That's guaranteed. And those who always play also don't necessarily always win, but playing is a precondition to winning. So don't be too stringent about when you play. Don't be too shutting yourself out or preventing yourself from playing, right? By making the standard too high for yourself to not make mistakes. Yeah, you know, in total, trying is a precondition to achievement. And sometimes you're going to fail, and that's okay. So my hot take here is that hot takes, thank you, David, are good. I like when David reassures me that. You know, I like when he tells me that, hey man, being young is about doing things. Being old is about reflecting. Because maybe he's wrong, you know, and maybe he's only 60% sure about that idea. But I've never heard anyone else in my life say an idea like that, you know, and he shared it with me. So I now have this small kernel of wisdom that I can carry with me. I can find great utility in it, and I might even have great utility in sharing that idea with others, like I'm sharing it with you right now. Whew. All right, so I'm gonna rewind a bit. Let's talk about the world being social again. I want to focus on that and how I believe that the world depends on open exchange. It depends on people sharing, and I think you can say that safely because it always has. And this has been our edge as a species. This is how we got to where we are now. And so in that same vein, I would say that social anxiety, it's kind of the next small topic here, is a survival strategy. And so some of us needed that more than others. And if you disagree with me and you say, hey, social anxiety is not a survival strategy, it's whatever, something else, I would just tell you that within my paradigm, what you believe, I think, is probably more accurately worded as, I think social anxiety is a bad survival strategy. I think that's what you really mean if you don't think it's a survival strategy. I think you really mean this is a bad survival strategy, which is why I wouldn't say it's a survival strategy, which is a good point, because it is a bad survival strategy when it isn't needed anymore. And there's times where it's not needed anymore. And so if we look back to the aforementioned hypothetical, the person with trust issues, right? I would say you're going to have a hard time finding someone who just randomly has severe trust issues without a history that can offer some kind of explanation. And even if you find those people who claim that they just always had trust issues and there's no rhyme or reason to it, there's nothing in the history, I would say they're probably just a young person who hasn't done enough self-reflection. That's probably what I would say is the exception. And so the big life hack here with our neuroses is knowing when to drop the survival strategies that used to work, they used to save us in our youth, or some other part of our life, but now that our life is very different from what it was like in our youth, we don't need it anymore. And so I'm gonna start making the case here that we can start, trying to peel back those things that don't work for us. But I will also say is that there's also gonna be some of you that are still using those old survival strategies because you still need them, because you're still living in a non-ideal environment where it's not safe for some reason, where you need to be anxious about looking behind your shoulder for whatever thing that could happen. But with me, I found it very rewarding to transcend the social anxieties that I have had in the past. I found it very rewarding to be increasingly open with people and to be myself and to share myself honestly with people. I try to keep challenging myself every day to, when appropriate, go out on a bit of a limb and talk about something I really genuinely believe or enjoy when I'm with someone, rather than closing myself out of that opportunity because I've decided it's too risky to be myself or just because I've become lazy. And so if you're feeling cynical about this, I'd say it's probably just because you're kind of divorced from those potential positive experiences that come from actually sharing yourself honestly and unashamedly with people. I think it's just been too long since you've felt what it's like to fly. And so you don't think you can fly anymore. And it's both fucked up and hilarious, but oftentimes when we grow up, other people tell us we're lame. They tease us for our hobbies, for our interests, and then later on when we're adults, even when we're surrounded by people who are more accepting, we still have a bit of that urge to hide some things, some hobbies or interests, because we've inherited those beliefs from people in our past sort of secondhand. Those people who teased us when we were young, we carry on their sentiment a little. So on one hand, you've got those things that you genuinely care about and you really like, and that's how you feel about them when they come to mind. But then on the other hand, you think about those people who criticized you for it, and especially if they're loved ones like your family or friends, they can sometimes live inside of our heads and just constantly re-utter that disapproval that they gave to you or that interest when you think about it. So you it can become of both minds, right? You have your feeling about it, and then the judgment you've had in the past about it can both live inside you equally strong. And because of that, we will self-censor. We don't want to be cringe. And the sad thing is that the only one in the room a lot of times calling you cringe for having those interests is yourself. And it's not even yourself. It's not even your true self. It's the ghosts of your past playing ping pong in your psyche. You know, a phrase I like, or it's a phrase, but it's also just, I don't know, truth about life is that I think people will take you as seriously as you take yourself. And so if you're sort of insecure when you bring something up, I think people are more likely to test you about that. They're more likely to kind of give you shit. If they sense that you're a little unwavering, you're not so confident about this. We sense that sort of thing from one another. And on the other hand, if you're firm, if you're serious about it, people will take you serious. And on some level, this is just basic context, of course, because if you say to someone, hey, what's the last thing you want to do before you die? But you say it sort of casually, right? If you're in a light conversation, you've got a smile on your face. What's the last thing you want to do before you die? You know, it's likely going to be interpreted as a joke. It depends on your delivery, because if you say it with a grave seriousness to it and you're straight-faced and all that, people will probably take that at face value. Or at least they're going to be more likely to. And so, for an example, if someone asks me, hey, what are you doing on Saturday night? If I try to be mousy about it, and I don't say it directly, right? And I try to hide it for some reason, what I'm doing on Saturday night, that insecurity, that mousiness, that's going to paint a strange picture of what I'm doing to them. And the mousiness might make them feel strange about what's happening. But if I'm just straightforward and unashamed, and I just say, oh yeah, I play TF2 on Saturdays. I do this community stuff where we host private competitive games. You know, I give out prizes. Sometimes people compete for money here and there. People are they're more likely to take that serious. They're more likely to take it serious than if I was transmitting some sort of energy of uncomfortability about it, right? If I seemed like I was trying to dodge it, or like, I gotta think of another story. And, you know, I'm consistently surprised, I'm consistently impressed with how overall, like, cool and reasonable people are in the adult world. You know? It's so much more reasonable than how people act when you're growing up as a kid. Because I think, you know, kids are so often concerned with not getting pushed down to the bottom of that hierarchy. They're so desperate that they'll really sell out anyone. You know, they're going to bend their morality just to ensure that they're not on the bottom of the food chain. That's the most important thing. You know, it's crazy. Kids will give you shit. They'll call you gay for tying your shoes, right? Like, even the most basic thing, they'll tease you for. But the thing is, a lot of those kids who were shitty to you in school about tying your shoes, they probably also had people be shitty to them about something equally silly. And so everyone does a little basic growing up and grows past these sort of nitpicks. And they also understand that they don't want to have that happen to other people in the way that it might have happened to them. So people do grow up a little bit, which is nice. And maybe I'm just crazy biased, you know, maybe I have some super tainted view of reality where I always find myself surrounded by good people. But consistently, I'm finding that the only thing holding me back from being a real honest person with others, it's just myself. You know, it's not other people's reactions. And even when I think it's other people's reactions, it's still myself. You know, you still should, especially if the reaction's not going to be great. Be your real self. Really argue what you actually believe, you know? Don't let that sort of make you sell out. And if you're gonna sell out, I would want to sell out like PewDiePie. I don't know if you could call PewDiePie a sellout, but did you guys know that PewDiePie's moving to Japan? I guess you might have heard. Felix Schellberg, the gaming YouTuber known as PewDiePie. He's not just planned to move, but he's actually now officially moved to Japan, and he's intending to be there indefinitely. And so, my relationship with PewDiePie is not very deep. I'm not a super fan by any means, but I think he's a cool guy. I have a good read on him. I get good vibes, and I've enjoyed, you know, watching an occasional video from him here or there over the years. He's been around for so long. And I appreciate, too, his branching out into more serious content. Like, he'll make a more serious video, and he'll try to branch into some other topics besides just, it's all gaming, it's all fun, which I appreciate. But I had to talk about this whole thing of him moving to Japan. It really brought up some things inside me that I wanted to address. I wanted to think about for myself, and I thought it'd be a fun thing to dialogue out loud as well with you here. So let's put down a little more context about this, and you'll start to see why I care about this. Because PewDiePie, here's the story. He jumped through a ton of hoops to make this happen. He got him, his wife, his 2 dogs to Japan. He's Swedish, his wife's Italian. They've been living together in the United Kingdom, I think, for maybe half a decade or so, I don't know. But after a lot of deliberation, they decided, hey, you know, what are we going to do with our lives? We want to live in Japan because we really like it there. And you can see some clues of this. This doesn't seem insane, you know. If you don't follow PewDiePie very much, he's definitely a classic Japanophile. And this is where it gets me. This is where I got to talk about it. This is where I have stuff at stake too, because I'm a fucking Japanophile. And everyone seems to be a Japanophile, you know? Gen Z loves Japan so much. American Gen Z people. And so I want to understand this. It's getting to the point where I'm like, what the fuck? What is this? Because there's something, you know, there's something there. So let's start here. The most prolific foreign cultural influence on young people in America today, what is that? Well, the key there is that it's foreign, right? That's the question. What's even influencing us from foreign culture? Well, the answer is anime. That's my answer. And because it's anime, it's Japan. I would say maybe a close second for K-pop. But really, what other distinctly foreign cultural export can you cite as being anywhere near as significant on the youth right now as anime? I don't know. And this topic, this is just like the breaking point. This has been itching at me for years and years, and I really want to pick apart what's going on with this interest in Japanese culture, and I want to feel like I understand it, because I used to just think, you know, this is just a thing some people are into, and now I feel like this is just the reality of how our culture feels or something. You know, for me, when I was young, I'll give you some of my backstory. When I was like 10 years old, I felt like my interest in Japan and Japanese culture, I felt like that was kind of unique, you know? Even then, you could say it wasn't unique to a huge extent, right? Because a lot of 10-year-old boys were into Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! And those are Japanese exports. But that still wasn't nearly to the extent as it is now, right? Where nowadays you see Japanese text on clothes in a shopping mall, and that's like normal. That's a normal hip thing to do, to have like, Japanese text or whatever. But what I've noticed as I've gotten older, I went from that feeling when I was very young to being like, oh yeah, this is something I'm into, and a lot of people don't even know anything about Japan. You know, a lot of my classmates when I'm 10 or whatever, besides Pokemon or whatever. And nowadays it's so different. Now I feel like I'm just the archetype of, you know, this 20-something American male with geeky hobbies. And I feel like being interested by Japan, I feel like that's just universal with people in my demographic. I don't feel special really at all. And I want to dig into that, because I used to think it was like a personal thing. I used to think it was a unique experience for me. And we'll talk about that more too, because my relationship to it is not about anime. I'm not really an anime fan. And I also don't think it's about just anime. I don't think that's the only reason why we're seeing this huge increase in interest in Japanese culture. And so I'm going to make a case for that, because I think there's this sort of increasing mass appeal to all things Japan, because a lot of the aspects of Japanese culture and society, I think they feel like a kind of solution for people in our culture to the things that are missing from our culture. I think Japanese culture offers this really distinct contrast to what we grew up in. And so it's one of those classic, like, we look at them and think, the grass is always greener. And I think a lot of Asian culture, but Japan too, I mean, a lot of the world looks at America and thinks, the grass is always greener. That looks so nice. And so part of the reason I think I felt like my connection to Japan was a little more personal growing up was because I wasn't really into the anime. That wasn't my connection. You know, my earliest memories of Japanese culture were very young, and it was from when my dad would bring home these toy trains from Japan, because he would go to Japan on business trips to like install software in the 90s. and the early 2000s, and I have vivid memories of the sort of Japanese text on some instruction manual or something, and this mythos of this foreign place that my dad would go on trips to. That was really the most memorable place I remember. Like, oh yeah, Dad's gone away. Where is he to? He went to Japan or something. And as I got slightly older, I had some new attachments to Japan, which was watching this television program, Sasuke, which is known as Ninja Warrior in America, on TV. And this is a topic which I've made some videos on. You can check those out if you haven't. But when I was a kid, I didn't really care that Ninja Warrior was Japanese. It could have just as well been Chinese or Serbian or whatever. But I liked it. It was this experience that was a strange mix where you had the gravely serious moments, but then you also had these gravely non-serious people that were there, and it was all about taking on this obstacle course that, for a young, rambunctious boy like myself, that seemed super fun to play on. I was very physical, and that looked like something I wanted to do. I wanted to try Ninja Warrior. And, there was this dramatic, eccentric announcer, and all these little things together are what made it so appealing to me. And it just so happened that because it was Japanese, the idea of Japan started to have a higher stock in my mind. But something I realize now is that it really couldn't have been from anywhere else. I said, it could have just as well been Chinese or Serbian. I mean, as far as the thought experiment is concerned, for my interest in it, yeah, it could have been from anything, and I would have still been interested in it. But in reality, it is uniquely Japanese. Sasuke was a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. That hodgepodge of things, that bit of people in goofy costumes, but then in the next scene, you've got some diehard competitor who's crying because, the absurd dedication they have to this thing for whatever reason. And all those things added up. This exact flavor that this TV show had, I think, is really just possible in a place like Japan. And even though Ninja Warrior has become a global phenomenon now, it got licensed to different countries, and a lot of people know about it. The American version, it retains that obstacle course part of it, the competitive experience, but it misses a lot of the charm. It doesn't have that essence that the original television show had, that had a lot of Japanese quirk to it. So those are the two things. We got the toys from my dad's business trips, we got Sasuke on TV, and now I'm getting a little older. I'm around age 9 or 10 or so, and I'm starting to get really into music, and I'm starting to have some internet access here and there. And so I start searching. The thing that got me on this path was I started searching for metal music from every country. So I literally just put a country's name and then metal, and just try to find anything. And as I'm trying out a lot of country names, I find that Japan is one that has a lot of results. And so, the long story short, I've essentially continued to explore Japanese rock and metal music, alongside a lot of other musical interests that I've had since I was 10 years old. And again, I don't think this is just a coincidence either, right? It's not just I like the country name, and so it happened to work out. And this is something that really made itself obvious to me in this last decade, because we're also now at a point where in our mainstream Western culture for the kids, it's actually not that weird to have some Japanese artists that you listen to. That's becoming increasingly normal. And if you don't think that's increasingly normal, it's way more normal now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Especially if you're a young male who grew up online. And I don't think this is an accident, because there's a lot of music from Japan that it's legitimately hard to find an analog comparison of in the Western countries. And the irony, of course, is that a lot of the bands that I would say have a distinctly Japanese sound, I don't think they wanted to sound uniquely Japanese, because a lot of those bands, if you ask them, they were mostly influenced by American bands or Western artists. And this was something that I always found interesting about much of the Japanese music artists I was listening to, even at a very young age, is that they seem to be most proudly influenced by Radiohead or System of a Down. It's always the Western American artists. It's not some artist from Japan. And so a lot of them try to emulate that sound, but as hard as they tried to sound like whatever American rock or metal band, it still came across in their own weird Japanese way. Another big difference is I feel like when you get a scan of a culture's overall music tendencies, it's almost like its own little proxy for IQ or something. You get the sense where you're like, oh, these East Asians are quite smart. They're quite intelligent. Because you can do the research for yourself, but I'll just sort of say, I think the standard of complexity from the instruments is just at a higher default level for lots of Japanese music. Like even just the generic pop music, I think there's a little more expectation of complexity there than you'll find in Western music. Like bass is one of those things we can always talk about. The Western mentality, I would say, in present day is to kind of complain that, hey, bass is an elite instrument, don't overplay that. And yet, if you look at Japan and a lot of Japanese bands, sometimes that's like the more exciting element than the guitars. Anyway, that's just one example, but there's a million. I don't want to talk forever here. And the next funny thing about this, trying to understand, hey, is Japanese culture actually unique, or is this just all because of anime? Why are people into this? Why was I into this? Is that just as Japanese bands have been mostly influenced by Western and overseas bands, they've also always been sort of poorly shoehorning English into their music for ages. And on one hand, this makes sense from a Western perspective because, hey, we won the war, so they're looking to us, right? And we won the culture war too for a long time until now. Now they're winning the culture war. But anyway, countries everywhere around the world idolize English. They idolize American culture because of Hollywood. And English is that big global language as far as many foreign countries are concerned. But it's really fascinating to me how that's now starting to horseshoe, right? Vaporwave in the 2010s was this breakout of Western culture that idolized Japanese culture, where you're putting janky Japanese in your song titles, which is what the Japanese have been doing with English in their song titles for like way longer. They've been doing that with their titles, their lyrics, their everything for years, and now we're starting to do that with their language. And so I'm putting all this context out there. I'm drawing these cases because for a lot of reasons, I don't think it's so random. I don't think it's so random, that anime has had the influence it has, but that Japanese culture at large has struck a big win with young Americans. I'm not personally much of an anime fan, but even the quirkiness of anime, just like the quirkiness of Japanese music or the quirkiness of Ninja Warrior, it's all made possible because of the Japanese culture. And so why does the Japanese culture appeal? I'm making the case to say, hey, look, it's not just random. It's not just because we want to like it. There's something actually about the exports of this place that has a bit of their essence, and their essence is desirable to us for some reason. So why? So for me, I would say some of my appeal to Japanese culture is their sensibilities in art, for one. They're very similar to the sensibilities I have artistically. I like dense arrangements. I like complexity. I like the emotional, often slightly less formally trained vocals, which you see a ton of in Japanese music, compared to kind of the Western standard for what a vocal should do. And then even if we're not thinking about art, there's this seriousness to Japanese culture, this emphasis of respect, which I totally vibe with. It seems very formal in a way that we don't have here. I've personally never been to Japan, but from all of my media absorption over the years, I've gotten the impression that the people really take some things so extremely serious over there. That's more the norm in their culture. And I mean, hey, you just look at their suicide rate, and that shows to be true. And if you know me, if you're this far in the video, you probably get that I'm a person with a strong, serious side to me as well. So you can see how that would sort of align. I have sort of high moral values. I'm concerned with respect, and that seems to be things that they value in their culture as well. And I even expressed earlier that one of my main grievances in my youth was that I felt like I didn't have people who wanted to have serious conversations around, right? Whether that be children or adults or adolescents or whatever you want to call it. So if that's a bit of why I relate, does everyone feel that way? Does everyone in my demographic find some solace in Japanese culture because it has those things that seem lost in America. It has that grave seriousness, the politeness, the respect, and that strangeness too. Is that why we all like it? And so, I gotta bring in my man Tiger Woods here, because there's a good quote where Tiger Woods is talking about Buddhism, because Tiger Woods, if you don't know, he's half Thai, and so he was raised Buddhist, and he continues to practice Buddhism. And he says he likes Buddhism because it's a whole way of being and living. It's based on discipline, it's based on respect, personal responsibility. And the last thing he says is he likes Asian culture better than our culture because of that, because it's based on discipline, respect, personal responsibility. And I vibe with that too. And then here you have Pewdiepie, who straight up decided, where's the best place I can live in the world, right? Maybe he has a bit of his heart too that's like missing that. I didn't get enough emphasis on discipline, respect, and personal responsibility, when I grew up. That's why I like Asian culture. That's why I like Japan. That's what Pewdiepie's thinking. And so, thinking about what he did, I have to ask myself the same question, right? If I had the most subscribers in the world, if I was balling out financially, able to live any kind of life I want, and for those who don't know, when you move countries, unless they're in your sort of thing, unless they're in your EU family or they're in your Commonwealth family, it's quite hard to move countries. You need a visa. It's a complicated process. You have to either jump through a lot of hoops, which are expensive and time-consuming, and at the very least, it takes so much effort, takes so much energy expenditure to do that. So it's not a light thing, right? But if you have the means to do that, if you have the energy, if you have the wealth, if you have the time, the patience, where would you go? Would I do the same thing that Pewdiepie did? Would I move to freaking Japan if I was at his level? That's why I wanted to talk about this, because the answer is maybe. Maybe I would at least consider that. And so we'll talk about that. Because there's two reasons that I'm not in Felix's shoes. The first is that I don't have 100 million subscribers yet. I don't have the wealth, the notoriety that comes with that. That would make it easy to get a visa anywhere I want. I'm sure Pewdiepie can get like a famous person visa or whatever, those ones they have where it's you're a highly accomplished entertainer or whatever. I mean, most countries have a visa like this. I don't have the means for that. And then the second thing is that, could I really live in fucking Japan? I mean, could I really leave my home country behind? Because for me, that's kind of tough. There's a lot of things to consider here. So for one, I've lived in a foreign country before. I lived in England. And while I really enjoyed it in many ways, it wasn't super clear to me that I, quote unquote, belonged there. It's not that I felt unwelcome there, but I don't know what it would take for me to feel like I really am from there, I'm actually from America, because I was born in America. I grew up in America. That's always going to be a part of me. And I feel that that's an important thing it's an important thing at the least because I can't change it. That's my life. That was my fate. We don't choose where we're born. We don't choose where we grew up. And so precisely for those reasons, it's always going to be a part of us. I can choose to live anywhere in the world that I want. But there's still only one elementary school that I went to. There's only going to be a couple neighborhoods that I can go back to, I can walk through, and they're going to fill me with that weepy nostalgia for my childhood. I can travel the whole world, and that's not going to change. Those formative experiences, those formative places, they're formative after all. They impact us in a big way, and they don't change. They're always going to be a part of us. You can't overwrite that. You can't rewrite that history. And even if they seem lame, right? Maybe if you grew up in some super lame town that you don't like anymore, I mean, that's still your town, Even if it is super lame compared to what you experience later in life, it still is going to have that unbeatable hue of, this is the place where it all began. This is the place where it began for you. This was where you experienced so many of your firsts. We can't change our firsts. We can't change how our firsts happened or where. And so that's what ties me to my hometown. That's what makes this a dilemma for me, that it would not be so easy to just run off and go to Japan, This is what ties me to my country. I didn't even have a big family growing up. I grew up with just my mother, just my father. All my other family lived far away in different states. It was a very small family vibe. And then my parents divorced, and it became even more quiet for a number of years, where now it was, instead of just my dad, just my mom, now it was just spending time with my dad or just spending time with my mom. And even now they've both moved away from my hometown. And so it's not like I have a lot of family pulling me to America. It's not like I have, that's my hometown with my family. I don't have that. There isn't even a place I feel like I particularly belong socially. But it's America. America is where it all started for me. That's a part of me I can never change. And so part of me feels like I would be a fraud or a traitor or something to move to another country and never come back. Or at least I feel like it would be dishonest to that part of me that can't change. Because on one hand, I can think of all the good reasons why I might enjoy another country more. But I feel a strange moral debt to my home. Even if my home was a lonely place that I wanted to leave, that's your home though. And this is going to tie into a longer, different talk about my overall morality and how I feel about the impact I want to have with my life that I won't really get into a ton right now, but I think I have a duty to try to leave this world better than I found it. I just think that's good manners. I just think that's reasonable. I didn't choose to be born, sure. No one else did. No one else did either. So do I really want to make the world worse for them too? Yeah, the answer is no. I don't want to do that. I'd rather do whatever I have in my power to give everyone else a better experience than I had. Maybe I can make that hometown, that home place that I grew up in, not so lonely. Maybe I can redeem it for myself and redeem it for others. Because you can always find a new life somewhere else. But there's some part of me that thinks maybe you can only heal or you can only rekindle your old life in one place. There's only one place you can do that. Speaking of the 90%, 100% sure thing, that was just off the dome, so I don't know. But maybe there's some truth to that. Now that's me, right? But as for Pewdiepie, he's Swedish. His wife's Italian. Europe, they have a whole different mentality with where they live. On one hand, they also are a little more tribal and sort of proud of their places and kind of shit on each other a lot. But, for many of them over there, living in a different European country, that's just like living in a different state in America. So if they live in the EU, they're allowed to move around freely, like you would in the States, because they don't need visas to do that. And then it's also a similar geographical distance, right? The distance between some of those countries is similar to the distance between states in America. And, they are more nationally aware, I think, because they rub shoulders with each other so closely. And they're so close to people who speak very different languages, too, and have quite different cultures. That's very different from America as well. And so they could have a stronger sense of national connection for that reason. But on the other hand, I think Pewdiepie already had a bit of a mentality that was different from mine growing up about where he lives, right? He probably had more of a worldly metropolitan attitude just from being in the EU, And he already lived in the UK for a while already. But I gotta also wonder, where's Pewdiepie's family? Where is Marzia's family? And again, they probably have very different experiences from me. Maybe Pewdiepie is a big family and it feels like, they're taking care of themselves okay, I hear some of my friends talk about that, where it's like, I don't feel like I need to have loyalty to my family because they have their own thing going on. That's huge. Whereas I maybe have a sense that I should be loyal to it, but it's also because I don't really have the strong family, But yeah, I gotta ask, what's with Marzia and Pewdiepie? Do they not have any loyalty to Sweden? What about to Italy, Marzia? I respect anyone's decision to leave their country. I think everyone can do that if they want. They can start a new life, and I think I should think that because that's the spirit of America. If you don't like where you're at, leave. America was founded on principle by people who were trying to flee from persecution in other places. They didn't like where they were before. They renounced their old government to create something greater. But I guess I'm just surprised, or maybe I'm even impressed at the conviction of PewDiePie or Marzia and anyone who just decides to do this. Because I guess it wouldn't be so easy for me. And I know they said, you know, he's like, oh, we thought about this a lot. So who knows? Maybe he had a big, long moral dilemma about it, just as I am having it out loud right now. But it makes me wonder, you know, if for example, I knew that I had no living family and I'm 100% not able to pass on my genes, I'm sure then I'd have less of a sense that I am tied to America. You know, a bit less. Then it would feel like it's less of a quandary if I move to Japan just for the sheer enjoyment of it. And maybe this is largely this is all just a huge projection of my own, but it's interesting to see how PewDiePie handles this shared dilemma, I think it's shared, of feeling a personal tug towards Japan. You know, I would say personally I still feel a strong pull towards Japan, but it's a mixed feeling. It's like an ex-girlfriend that you have a messy history with. I love her, but I know she's bad for me, or at least I worry that she's bad for me. And I think maybe it'd be better for her if I weren't in her life as well. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm envious too of people who are able to make such a bold choice that I wouldn't be able to make. You know, I don't prefer for things to be this way, for me to have the disposition that I do on this topic, but perhaps that's only because I don't understand it well enough, and so maybe one day I'll be more enlightened about this and I'll have a more holistic view on everything. You know, but right now on paper, it'd be nice to have been born into a strong family, you know, that strong roots in a certain place that I would ache to be away from. That's super enviable. If I was just like, yeah, this is my fucking home and I can't leave this, or like, this is always going to be super important, you know? If I were really strong on that side, I envy that. And then equally so on the other side, it would be personally convenient to feel that, you know, I have no loyalty to America. That would be quite convenient as well, to feel like I have no connection to my hometown and I could really just go anywhere. No desire to accept the fate of the path I've been born into, despite all the reasons I may have distaste for it. I am some guy. You might know me as Casual TF2. I think all these thoughts. I have my own personal reflections about where I am in life and how life has been so far. How it usually is, trying to make sense of what's going on. And I would say mostly I'm quite in the zone these days. Just like David said, I'm doing things, I'm busy, I'm being a young person. I'm trying to keep experiencing and keep experimenting. But as always, here and there, I just have a glimpse of some strangeness. I have some weird feelings, and I have like a glimpse of a bigger perspective of looking at my own life, of looking at the years gone by. You know, and when you have those moments, I also briefly remember how I felt before at different moments that I kind of forgot the feeling of, that I haven't experienced in a long time. And when I look at my life now, I feel like I do a pretty good job of keeping myself entertained. I do a good job of choosing to stay interested in things. But I still, every once in a while, I have that brief, what the fuck, that double take moment where I realize that I've basically been pedaling through the same things my entire life. Like almost everything I'm into right now is what I was into when I was 10, which is kind of weird. Maybe it shouldn't be weird, but it feels weird to me. You know, right now I'm making a video of some kind. And I made videos of some kind when I was 10. And you know, nowadays I'm super deep into music. I'm appreciating music. I'm trying to find more. It's a big part of my life. And that's what I was doing when I was 10. And even a lot of the artists that I discovered by the time I was 10 are still some of my favorite, most respected artists now, even despite the fact that I've discovered thousands more since then. And I could go on and on. I could give you a lot of different examples, but the main substance of my life, the main things I look forward to, the main things I'm interested in, even trying to understand reality better, that's been what life has been about for so long. When you're really young, like from age 0 to 10, everything's so new. You know, there was a time in that sort of era where I didn't appreciate music. There was a time where I didn't know how to use a computer, and there was a time for all the things that I didn't know anything about. Does that make sense, the wording? You know, there was a time when I didn't know about religion. I didn't know about drugs. I didn't know about other languages. I didn't know about video games, about politics. I didn't know about anything. But now, most of my life has been spent with like a decent baseline understanding of those kinds of things and most kinds of things that are just regular parts of the human world. Like, we can say, yeah, there's still so much out there, man, but like, the main categories I understand. It's not like somebody's going to show up and be like, oh, do you know what money is? Do you know what rocks are? Like, there might be a type of money or a type of thing to do with rocks that I don't know about, but you start to run out of those big, broad categories as you inevitably become an adult who's familiarized with this world. You know, as an adult, it's not really so much about novelty of new things, of new entire concepts. I think as an adult, it's more about you go deeper into things that you already knew, and you're testing how deep you really can go into those things. Like, it's a new idea for me within the last year or two that people actually change quite little from who they are as children, and that, you know, this idea that we're so different as adults, you know, we really change from who we are as children. Maybe that's not an idea we should give much credit to. Maybe that's not as true as we think it might be. And in my case, I'm finding that shockingly true right now. That, you know, I can point to all the parts of me that has changed, and how I actually had quite a different temperament in my youngest years from what I had in my adolescent years. But my core interests, the core of who I am, a lot of my core personality, that's been retained. And you could say it's been an upgraded version, but it's still that same flavor of who I always was. So I kind of look to, like, when did all that start? When did all that stuff start that's still now a part of me? And it seems like the center of my life might have been those sort of preteen years, that age of 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. That's the years when I discovered and dove deep into a lot of things that would become my core interests. You know, that's when I first became acquainted with music, with computers. It was the first experiences you have with adult things like romance and sexuality. And then for me, it was also when my parents divorced. And that kind of draws a clear line in the sand between even just two eras of relationships between my parents. And I don't mean just between them, but like between me and them, right? There's how I acted with them before, and then there's now this new thing, right? An individual relationship, a separate individual relationship with each of them. And at that same age, around the divorce and all that, that was also the same age when I had my first real personal experiences playing video games. And just being online in general, I would say. Which is stuff I still do now. And so, you know, a few minutes ago when I brought up that initial line of, hey, you might know me as Casual TF2, I have thoughts, isn't that crazy? I started talking like that because I was on the path of saying that, you know, if you're sensible with what seems to be going on here in reality, it kind of seems like everyone is a person having their own experience. And in spite of that, it seems like we mostly deal with the same shit. We're mostly having a similar experience. I'm going to make the case for that, and I think that's really wild. Because here I am, I'm some guy, I'm saying all this stuff, and you're some guy, you've got all this stuff you could say. There's probably all kinds of things you could relate to here, just as I'm sure you could say all kinds of stuff that I could relate to in different ways. But it's so wild to comprehend that it's probably a very reasonable conclusion to draw that everyone is having a similarly weird experience here, you know? On the micro level, we like to break it down and be like, no, everyone's very different, actually. Our lives and our feelings and our experiences and thoughts, it's all these different factors, which it's there, true, but that's just the the scope of what you're looking at, right? If I look at things at a very grand level, I think about the strangeness that I'm having a sentient experience, and you're probably having that too. On the grand level, we have a lot in common. We have a lot of similar experiences, you know? We're all born by two parents. We all have exactly two parents. That's inevitable. And we all experience the shift from childhood to adulthood. That's something we all experience too. We all experience that transition from every new topic being completely new to you to being like, what? What's ghosts? What's a job? You know, we all go from that age to the age where we kind of know what most things are in the world. You know, we all experience that transition. We all have relationships, friends, family members, and they all come and go in different ways. And then we're all dealing with this fact that might be buried deep in the back of our minds or in the front of our minds that we're bound to come and go. You know, that's lurking under all of our hoods. And how strange is that, you know? Isn't this a strange system? That there's like millions of us or billions of us, and everyone has their own rich personal story, right? You're so immersed in your personal story, and think about how fucking crazy your life has been, just in how real it's been, and all the distinct nuances of it. And then now there's like 1 million of those, or 1 billion, or 7 billion. And everyone was born without a choice, and you have to live a life, and you have to die one day. But one day the bot crisis is gonna end. And right now, you know, we're in the thick of it. It's really hard to play TF2 without finding bots when you queue for casual. So it's kind of hard to remember because we're so used to it. We're so in the thick of it. It's been years now. It's hard to remember, just as we ourselves are destined to die, our problems are destined to die as well. It's just always a question of who's going to perish first, you know? Us or our problem? Because there's going to be a day where the bot crisis ends. In some way, that's going to happen. Within our lifetimes, I would say, too. And maybe that's because it's fixed by Valve. Maybe that's because the game is just so old that they turn the bots off. You know, the people who run them, it just starts to be more trouble for them than it is for us to keep them on. That day's coming, and you need to remember that. That's inevitable. And there's going to be a renaissance, you know? A tremendous feeling of relief. And maybe not for everyone, you know? Maybe some people are going to be upset. Some people are going to say it came too late and that it doesn't matter anymore. It's too late. But for some, no doubt, they're going to enjoy their salvation. They'll have lived to see it. They'll have lived to see that promised day finally came. That there was a prophecy after all. You kind of forget that there's a prophecy to be fulfilled when you're just so used to things being the way that they are. It's like, oh yeah, there was a place all this was going. We're reminded of that when things actually happen that kind of create a change. And that for as much as things might seem stagnant, nothing remains stagnant forever. And this ties into something I've been realizing lately, another thing, which is that in my life online, I put out a lot of content. You know, I have a lot of presence online. Some of you know I have a few different outlets, but there are many than anyone would ever guess. And I'm constantly inundated with all these things online. I'm constantly looking at view counts, at like counts. I'm constantly looking at comments, private messages across dozens of accounts on dozens of different online environments. I'm very plugged in. And when you're constantly in this onslaught of notifications, you can't help but start to ponder about it, you know, and say, well, what makes the difference here? What pulls in the numbers? What pulls in the messages? And what doesn't? You know, there's always some elusive magic to an algorithm and what the weather is going to be like on a particular day. But there is one trend I always notice that I buy into, I believe, which is that people are ready for good news. They really are. And most people already know that bad news sells, but we often forget that good news sells too. Truly good news sells hard, man. The difference between good news and bad news is that the bad news is pretty easy to find. It's pretty effortless to shine a light on. You really don't need to find it. I'd say it's just everywhere. You know, existence itself, if you be brutally honest, is kind of a fucking tragedy. So all you got to do is report on it. But good news, on the other hand, I think good news is a little more special, because people don't want to hear the good news of, hey, good news, you're alive. It's easier for people to understand, hey, bad news, you're gonna die, right? That's a little easier for people to understand. Good news has to be something that we put into the world. It requires vision. It requires execution. It requires more than just observing how things are, I find, for us to really feel like it's good news. And so that's my thesis statement here, is that you have to create good news. And that's a challenge. And it's still going to be a challenge for me, but I try to view things in that lens now with how I'm involved and how I'm interacting with others online. You know, I want to create good news. Good news is what gets engagement online. That's my motto, that's my approach. Because good news gets people engaged in real life too. It's not about online, it's just that's what people really feed off of in a meaningful way. You know, good news gets us excited about life. It gets us moving forward. I think people really start to die. They start to lose a bit of their sanity, a bit of themselves, when they don't have any good news. And it's easy to imagine good news, but it takes a lot more from you than imagining to make it real. It's that execution, that's the commendable part. Because I could say right now on paper, hey, wouldn't this be great? I can give you all sorts of quick good news that I haven't actually done the work to make real, right? I could say, hey guys, part 3 of that video that I last uploaded 2 years ago, it's finally coming out this Friday, and people would be hyped, you know? Or I could say, all right guys, I'm giving away $100 to the 3 people that make the best TF2 song this week. That would be great news. Or I could say, hey, there's going to be a casual TF2 LAN in September. Here's the dates. Book it. That'd be great news. I know a lot of people would be excited. And those are great ideas. Those are things that would be certainly good news, but I've got a billion of those ideas floating around, you know? I could just keep printing those forever. And the thing is actually doing them, you know, and that's why I'll keep staying active in this world, why I'll keep speaking right now, why I'll keep making this video, because the good news needs to become real, you know? Everyone wants it, so honestly too. Everyone is looking for good news. You know, and think about it. What is the best news you could tell yourself? What is the best news you could tell your friend? You could tell your father? And when you think about those questions, don't be weighed down by other people's expectations. Don't focus on others' expectations, or even your own expectations, when you ask yourself what would be good news. Because I think that's coming from a mentality of fear of failure, right? It shouldn't be imagining how your friends and family and yourself are insufficient. It shouldn't be imagining that scene where insufficiency is solved by sufficiency, that's attained, and now you're smiling from joy because you solved the problem. And that's real sometimes, but don't focus so much on the if I do this, then I won't have the pain anymore. I mean, deal with your pain for sure, but the whole point of this good news shtick is that we actually need positive stuff too, because the pain is just endless, man. There's always going to be more pain in life. And because, like I said, life is, you know, ask the Buddhists, ask Tiger Woods, life is suffering. So it's about what's going to make you smile from joy. What's the good news you should create? And good news, that's made by the people who are willing to create it. Another way we can frame this, make it more personal, just about you right there, hey, I'm talking to you, is what's coming up in your life that's new and exciting? And if there's nothing, you need something. You ought to have something new and exciting coming up in your life. There needs to be something to look forward to, because life without progression, that's what instills a feeling of nihilism. And life of progression is what will cure that feeling. Life is good when we feel real, when we feel that we actually have an impact on things, that life is a actually a malleable agent that we can really influence. That's what really affirms us in a positive way, feeling that we have influence. And this throws back to that topic about being pro-social and how everything's about interaction, because interacting with other people is one of the things that makes us more real. It's what makes them more real too, and being real is what it's all about. Just as we have to make things real or make ourselves real for things to be better, someone had to make you real. Oh man, now we're talking about this. I'm sure there's some people watching who are bitter about being born, and they despise their parents for having them, and they say, oh man, my parents had me for selfish reasons, man. And so with those people, I'm not going to try to shine a light on them or change their minds in this next ramble, but rather I'm going to focus on the people in the middle of the aisle, right? So on that far side, you have the antinatalists who, for whatever reason, which by the way I would say is usually their own traumatizing experience of being alive, they've decided it's no good to have a kid. Which, it's basically like confessing things would have been better off if you weren't born, if that's your viewpoint, which is pretty dark. But some people also had pretty dark childhoods, so you have to empathize with that and understand why they would take that stance. And then on the other side of the aisle, you have the people who are like, yeah, I'm gonna have kids. Yeah, I want to have kids. Why not? And people with that attitude, that's most common, I'd say, with religious people. Definitely people who have a great relationship with their parents. Think, oh, well, I freaking love my parents. Why wouldn't I want a kid? We'd love each other too, and it'd be great. But then in the middle, right, in the middle between those two crowds, you have a lot of people who I think just haven't really thought about it enough. They haven't gotten real about it. And, to some extent, it takes time, right? Nobody instantly has thought about all this stuff, right? There's a bit of natural maturation over age where you start considering this more and more. But I think a lot of people are just kind of never thinking about it. And, so what I've written down for this part of the video, my note here is, it's weird to me how most people talk about the prospect of having kids. And I'm saying that word for word, and I'm letting you know about that because the thing I find funny now, even looking at that, is that my thought was it's weird. It's weird. I'm weirded out by how people talk about the prospect of having kids. And now, before I get deeper into that, before I explain why it's weird, understand a bit about my biases, right? Which is that the young people I hang around are people living in my city, and my city is considered like one of the most liberal, left-leaning cities in America on every list you're gonna find. So it might be different where you are, but from my experience in life, when I ask 20-somethings and I say, hey, have you thought about if you're gonna have kids or not? I mostly get the same type of response. And the way the response is, it indicates that the person I'm asking hasn't really thought about the question at all. That's part of it. But then oftentimes the way they answer it, it's in this sort of aloof manner, as if the decision to have children is just like this casual preference anyone can have, in the same way that you might have a preference to have your coffee with cream or to take it black. It's like, oh yeah, some people have tattoos and some just don't. It's just whatever you want. Some people like soup and bread bowls, and some people don't like having soup in a bread bowl. I feel like that's how a lot of people think about it when I ask them, and that's what I find weird when a lot of people engage with that kind of questions, because they answer it with this tone that's really, I think, more of an appropriate tone for whether or not you're into bread bowls. And in case you think I'm being a bit of a prude here, and you think the decision to have kids is just some casual preference, like whether or not you're iPhone or Android, let's take some time. Let's emphasize that the only reason any of this exists is because people had children. So at the very least, we can probably agree that you literally wouldn't exist if your parents decided not to have you. But then if we go to an even broader level, maybe we can agree that everything in our modern world, this level of civilization we have, our mastery of technology, the comfortability we enjoy, that we survive the harsh elements of nature quite easily inside of our shelters. We have schools, we have all these pastimes, we have a variety of food and drink, we have media, all the perks of 21st century civilization, they all required people having children and considering the future of the world and thinking, hey, what's this all going to be like after I leave it? What do I want it to be like? And, you know, that sounds good, but let's also remember that you're literally a fucking animal, you know? And my choice of curse word there is no mistake either. You're an animal, yeah, but you're an animal that fucks. You're a fucking animal. And why do animals fuck? Well, fuck, you know, the biological incentive for sex and fucking and opposite sex attraction, what's that all for? It's there so that you can have children. Because if you didn't have that impulse of, wow, sex feels good in you, if most forms of life didn't have that impulse, they'd just go extinct because it simply isn't going to occur to us or to the animals especially, to have sex, right? If it doesn't feel good. And even if they realized it, they were like, oh wait, this is possible. We could do this act that derives no pleasure for us. Animals probably wouldn't have the moral reasoning to think, hey, you know, would this be a reasonable thing to do so that someone else can have a subjective experience of reality and live a life like I have? But we do have the capability to do that, right? Which is interesting. We have the capability to realize, hey, the penis, the vagina, these are reproductive organs. We have the reasoning to be like, wait, why do women have breasts and men don't? And then you're like, oh wait, breasts literally exist to feed a baby. And then you look to mammals and you're like, oh, that's not unique to us. That's how this works. And so I'm bringing all this in to remind us of why having children is a little more of a serious topic worth considering than just being some style of the week fashion choice that you can really be like, yeah, you can go either way about it. Who cares? You can wear trousers or you can wear shorts. What does it matter? The irony, of course, and why this is especially weird to me, is that in spite of all these young 20-somethings not taking this topic very seriously as this moral quandary, maybe a moral duty, maybe an essential part of existing in this reality, in spite of not really caring much about that, people are obsessed with sex. Sex is so everywhere in our world, in our culture. And like the most ubiquitous content online, what is it? It's porn. And so this is why it's weird to me, because it's not like there's some logically consistent wave of 20-somethings who are both not interested in having kids and not interested in having sex, because they're just not interested in the animal part of being in general, right? That would make sense. That'd be logically consistent. I'd be like, oh, I get it. You're just like not wanting to be a slave to our biology, you know? But then it's not like that at all. The young people of the 2020s are the most sexually liberated, the most sexually emboldened generation to live in human history. If not because of the culture, then also because of our access to what we can embolden and indulge ourselves with on the internet. That generation seems to also be forgetting, like, oh yeah, you know, all this sex stuff is just a biological impulse to have children, right? Like people, it sounds crazy to some of you. Some of you are like, yeah, dude, I know this. Some people literally forgot. Some people literally forget that, and it's just become something like, oh yeah, there's pizza out there. Like pizza's a food, you know. It's just like how sex is something that you can do, and they've like forgot that it actually there's a reason why it exists or why we have those impulses that is explainable and makes sense, and maybe is worth considering, right? Because it's kind of fundamental to how life continues to exist. You know, on one hand, our current society is very tapped into its animal nature. Our current society is like, fuck, and fuck just because it feels good. Society be like, oh, if it feels good, that's enough of an okay reason to want to fuck. But then at the same time, our current society, the mass consciousness is also saying, oh, having kids, that's just an option. That's just like whether or not you like baseball or not. That's not a big deal. And so it's weird to me, you know, some people, they're surprised when you genuinely ask them, like, hey, have you thought about having kids? And then, on the other hand, no one would be surprised. People would laugh at you because it's so fucking obvious if you ask them, Hey, have you ever thought about masturbating? Have you ever considered whether you're interested in having sex? People would. That's not even a serious question, because people. That's such a given in our current mass consciousness that those things are on the table, but that is masturbation an option? No, of course not. Is having kids an option? Of course. It's strange to me that on one hand we are very celebratory of our animal instincts, but then on the other hand we're really disconnected from that reality that we are indeed animals, and not in a way that's making it be like, ooh, that's bad, we're animals. It's like, no, we still have to respect the fact that we operate like animals, and we'll need to do some animal things to survive, right? Like eating, like sleeping, like procreating. And this is why I didn't want to convince people on certain sides of the aisle or the alley or the spectrum of how you can feel about this, right? Because some people are going to say, hey, I've thought about this a lot, and having kids, it honestly scares me. I'm worried that I'm going to do what my parents did to me, and it just puts a really bad, nervous, anxious feeling in me. And I say, whatever. That's, I think that shows you're at least trying to engage with the consideration. You're at least entertaining the idea, and you're being honest about your reaction. And there can always be a next conversation, right, about what's worth doing there and what I might tell people who are against having children for those reasons, right, for their personal experiences, giving them a certain view, and at least they're on principle, right, thinking consistently. They're thinking that way on principle rather than just being like, what are you talking about, man? No one's thinking about that. Your 20s? Your 20s are about, you're supposed to get a big salary. You're supposed to drink a lot of coffee, and then you're supposed to go to Coachella. Because that's how, even if people don't say that to your face, that's how a lot of people live in what I observe. And so it's like, okay, then what? What the hell are you going to do when you're 30? What are you going to do when you're 40? You're just going to keep making buckets and buckets of money and keep going to Coachella forever? That's really the thing to do? Rumor has it that there's this part of life that's maybe as essential as life and death. And people only consider childbearing non-essential nowadays because they forget that literally thousands of generations had to have a child every single time in a row for you to exist. Like, if just one of your ancestors was like, nah, I'm not really into bread bowls, my life's not about having kids, then you wouldn't exist to be here and posture about bread bowls. So yeah, that's weird to me. Something else I've been thinking about is that I'm paying a lot of attention to how we exchange value, especially creators and people who enjoy their content. A lot of things in this world seems to be focused about exchanging value. And the interesting thing to me about that is that our perceptions about what's valuable is very different. What someone else could offer to you, and you would find to just be the most valuable thing ever, they might be like, yeah, it's just okay. Or they might even be like, this is troublesome for me to give to you. Even though this causes tremendous value for you, this is actually kind of troublesome for me. And, it makes me a little sad that reality does work this way, but it often does. Someone who creates the item of value for someone else, they might really slave over it, and they might overall have a very trying, difficult experience to create it. And particularly as the creation of value becomes more rewarding in an abstract way, like art, for example, I think there's a higher chance that the person who created that might even have to undergo significant negative feelings in order to bring life to this thing, which other people are gonna reap the rewards from and get positive feelings out of. And so, even though this makes sense, and I'm like, yeah, okay, I see this, it's still hard for me to stomach sometimes, especially when I'm so connected to one side of that process, when you're so used to seeing things the way that you are. When you're so used to receiving a thing of value and you love it so dearly, that thing or the person behind that thing, it just becomes holy in your world, It's like a place of sanctuary. And so you got to ask, what is the cost of maintaining a sanctuary? Because maybe for them, maintaining that sanctuary is a type of hell. And so as much as it might be a sanctuary for you, someone's got to struggle with it themselves to create that, to have the upkeep of a sanctuary existing. And it can work both ways, of course, you know. It can also work for the positive. Maybe someone who's struggling to create that value and feels that they are in hell can remember the sanctuary they're creating for others, and that will help them overcome their suffering. And that's an important part, because if we weren't able to view that potential in our mind, it's hard to say if we would do a lot of the stuff that requires hard work. Right? It's hard to say that we would put in the work to make good news in this world if we didn't have the capacity to vividly imagine that potential of the good news. And again, I think this is part of what might separate us from other animals. You know, we can bear the pain of a very pedantic, seemingly meaningless task that in the moment, if you break down what's happening, it's like literally not intrinsically rewarding. But we'll do it because we can visualize that sanctuary we're approaching by putting that effort in. And for some reason, this makes me think of how I collaborate with people, because I keep having this observation that I feel like I don't collaborate well. And I wouldn't say it's because I'm a bad collaborator, but I would say it's because my creative style is sort of different from a lot of creative people that I've met, or just from a lot of people that I've met. You know, my process creatively is that I have so much faith in that final sanctuary that maybe I even have too much faith in that final sanctuary, where sometimes I'll just be so lenient with certain pieces of the work because I'm like, we're gonna get there in the end. It doesn't matter. Like, I'm almost like overly positive about it. And so my approach is to not be super stingy about certain small details on their own, and I'm worrying more about how it's all gonna connect in the end. And I think this is similar to how they made that TV show, Lost. And I mean that as a joke, but I'm also kind of serious. Because on Lost, they really just wrote the first season with no expectation for the show to be renewed. And then it ended up doing really well. It was all popular, and they were like, oh shit, we have to actually write more episodes of Lost. We weren't planning for this at all. And so they kind of just kept making things get crazier and crazier. And they kept rolling with that, like, well, let's just amp it up. It got very convoluted, and it had this sort of vague promise that it would all make sense at the end, that we'd reach that sanctuary, and there's debate as to whether that happened, but that's not the important part here. We don't need to talk about whether Lost was successful or not right now. In that regard, I brought it up because I think what separates me from a lot of people creatively is that I just see my bar where I see potential in things is lower, I guess. Like, I see potential in a lot of stuff that other people would just write off as being fruitless. And I've witnessed this so many times in a collaborating environment. You know, when I've written music with other musicians, I'll often observe the other person or other people, they might screw around with something. They're trying to come up with that next idea for a part. And so many times, like, just watching them play, I'm already like, oh, wait, freeze. Wait, do that again. No, wait, that was good. Wait, freeze. What if we used that in this way? But without my intervention to be like, wait, what was that? They'll often just keep noodling around for a while. Like, and it's quick. It doesn't take long for me to be like, oh, yeah, that. What if we did that with this? And I think that's because it's just this big aspect of creativity is being able to observe and have those things pop out to you. And I know that those things will pop out to me in situations where they won't pop out to others. You know, like a great photographer. I'd say a great photographer is someone who can see a great photo in any kind of scene that they're in real life, you know. There's definitely got to be great photographers who maybe they thrive off of a super controlled environment. You know, they're super picky about what they have to photograph, about what's in the frame. You know, they're very discerning, which is good, but there's also something to be said for the fact that a really good photographer, they're just going to have this knack for seeing the aesthetic moments in mundane reality that a normal person would be blind to. And that's their expertise, you know? And so that's how I think my creative process works in a lot of ways, by being very open to even the smallest, strangest, seemingly unimpressive thing on its own, as seeing like, yo, this could be the start of a sanctuary. This could be a start of something amazing. And that even though this looks not special right now, I know that you can assemble something around this that's going to make it seem magical. But when you're at that beginning stage, when you just have that tiny little disassembled piece, plenty of people aren't going to believe it's magical when they just see that thing on its own that you start with. And that can be a problem, because if you can't imagine that place where we are going, if you're not imaginative, if you don't have, if you can't give it the credit that small shitty thing will become magical, or that it could, it's going to be quite hard to actually make it magical. And I've noticed a lot of times in those creative dynamics, I'm always the one who's excited by lots of ideas quite easily. And so I'd say people who I work well with are people who are eager to try anything, right? They feed off of that well. And, they're willing to take even the strangest prompt or seemingly uninteresting concept and run with it. You know, when I'm like, yo, let's try this, let's work with this. What about that? And people I don't work so well with are probably most people who will hear things I say and they'll just be like, they'll either think I don't think that's a very good idea, that's not interesting to me, or they'll just straight up say like, I don't get it, like I'm not following you. And people are usually convinced by what I've made when I'm done, I've observed. But sometimes it's really hard to sell people on that beforehand. You know, sometimes people really can't see that whole picture or believe in something in those primordial stages where it requires some imagination to see the beauty in. And I think that's my asset creatively. And so I'm saying all this because it's important for me as well to keep reminding myself of that sanctuary at the end, that it's worth attaining, because sometimes I can get stuck in the world of like, yeah, so what, ideas, I can think of a million good ideas. It only matters when you actually put in the work, which has a lot of truth to it. The work is what makes it real, like I said before, but it's important for me to remember just how real and valuable good news is once it's been created, because again, something we mentioned earlier, if you're out of touch with something for a while, you start to forget what it's like. In a weird way, the longer we are away from good news, the more we can start to forget that good news even exists. Now back to the idea of the creator and the consumer having a sort of a different experience from each other. Sometimes you're going to really relish and enjoy the creation that someone else suffered to create. With regards to that, it helps me understand why a lot of my own heroes might have thrown in the hat, or quit or changed their direction in life and abandoned that thing that I thought was like so good. Like, no, don't stop doing that. You're adding so much value to my life and so many people's life by doing that. And on paper, that's easy for me to say on my side of things, that I wish they just kept making that same incredible tier thing again and again, even if it was just formulaic. But you have to ask yourself, what was the cost of them making that thing, even once? Because maybe the cost was more trying than I considered. Things that are really special, things that are really unique, sometimes they're like that just because, no one bothered to think of them. It's just like, wow, that's actually something nobody else has considered. But that's not always it. Sometimes things are really special and really unique just because it's too bothersome for most people to actually decide that they're going to commit themselves to that vision, right? The guy who, has seen 15,000 Starbucks coffees and is still going, that's a very unique and special life. And that's isolated as a headline, that's quite fun and interesting. But the reason it's special and unique is because most people wouldn't think it's worth doing, It's because only one person thought, this is worth doing and I will do it, And that's the difference. I always think of this this moment from the Gulnarius Best of Braving Days live DVD, where you have this moment in between songs where Shu, the guitarist, he sort of gleefully shouts the name of their lead singer while he's with him, and they're staring into the crowd. And the way he shouts it, it's like he's really, you just see him mouth the name, and it's like he's really celebrating him. He's really celebrating the singer in the way that a fan would. He seems like just as psyched as I am. You know, it's like, dude, it's motherfucking Yama B. It's him at his peak, man. And this moment, it always hits really hard for me, especially when I consider the context that this iteration of the band was kind of in its final days. You know, Yama B, that singer, he was about to leave the band, despite being such an integral part of their sound up until this point. You know, he was just as much of the band, you know, as anyone. And maybe he was most of the sound, you could argue, in some ways. And so to the fans, from everyone on the outside, you say, why would you leave, you know? People who really appreciated the band at that time knew that it was that incredible guitar work and the incredible vocals that made this band so powerful and epic. Like, those were the two things that really set it as awesome. And it's weird too, because you see them performing, it seems like they really enjoy the music, and you as a fan, you get catharsis from it too. But you gotta remember, there's so much that goes on behind the scenes to create that one really enjoyable night for your average fan. And sometimes all that stuff that goes on behind the scenes can be quite unglamorous. And, you know, for those people that make it happen, at some point, for a lot of them, whatever goes on, whatever has to happen invisibly behind the scenes to create that joy at the end that everyone appreciates, at some point it's not worth it anymore. You know, there is all that feedback that you get from the fans at the end, but oftentimes the most meaningful interpersonal feedback you get as an artist is what happens between you and your fellow collaborators. You know, did you feel heard in the process? Was it fun to work with these other people? Were there quarrels about how it should be done? Was there a tough point where you had to fight about what it was going to be like? Did you disagree, right? It's very rare that people agree entirely in these kind of big collaborations. And, you know, even considering all that trouble that goes on to make things possible, I again ask, what choice do we have, you know? Especially when you're someone who's tasted the greatness that kind of effort creates. Yeah, it can be nice to slow down, you know, you can ease the pressure on yourself, that's a relief. But then you also have to deal with this emptiness of not having created that great thing that inspires people, you know? That thing that you used to do that showed proof that you gave it your all, right? You might be living a little more comfortable life, but you might also not be getting as much of a high, as much of a satisfying reward as you did from that thing that was really tiresome and difficult to do. And that makes me think of Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods is someone I've always seen as this sort of enigmatic hero, you know, a type of ideal character. Someone who's so dedicated to their craft that, you know, the rest of their life will slip into chaos. And it has in front of the public eye many times. And it's very easy for us to criticize these types of people and say that, you know, oh, they have no work-life balance, they're torturing themselves, they're just fulfilling some strange fantasy of their parents and they were forced into it. But try to also empathize with their experience. You know, once you're already so invested into something, what else are you going to do with your life? I think we're all pretty aware of this idea of diminishing returns, of sunken cost fallacy, which is that we say just because you've gone down a path for a long time doesn't mean you need to justify continuing going down that path. And that's true when going on that path was genuinely a bad choice, but we have to make sure it was a bad choice, right? When you look at people like Tiger Woods, even though there's all this pain, these trials, these immense challenges and difficulties that made him who he is and continue to make him who he is, at the end of the day, that man loves golf. That's a fact. And if he didn't love golf, he'd be done by now. His dad's dead. He's too old to play by most people's standards. He's already won every single accolade you could want to win as a golf player. He's been injured so many times, he keeps getting set back by his body, and yet he still keeps going. This guy still wants to play golf at a high competitive level, at a world-class level. He keeps recommitting himself to the sport. He loves it. And so people love to talk about the sunken cost fallacy. But what about the fallacy of quitting something because you think you're too deep into it, right? You could say that Tiger Woods has all this other kind of potential life that he could live if he quit golf, which is true. But who else could play golf like Tiger Woods? It's not like anyone could live the normal life, but not anyone can be Tiger Woods. If Tiger Woods quit being Tiger Woods, who else is going to be Tiger Woods? Even the best replacement for Tiger Woods isn't Tiger Woods. And I'd say in that same way, if Yama B quits Gulnarius, who else is going to sound like Yama B in Gulnarius? Because even the best replacement for Yama B isn't Yama B, and that's what happened. They have a replacement, and I respect him, but it's different. It's a different energy, even in doing his best to fill that role. And so, when you know what it's like to get so deep into one thing, whether that's playing golf or being in a power metal band, as tempting as it might be to return to the normal world, to a less intense life, to a more varied life, isn't it just as tempting to keep going further? Because you're already so much deeper into this thing, you're able to keep going deeper into it, into this place, so much deeper than anyone else is, because you already have all this distance covered. And of course, you also can consider at one point that you might want to do it as much for the fans as you do it for yourself, because the power of the impact you have on them can be pretty great. And so I find myself in a similar position, or I don't even know if similar is the right word, but I'm thinking about a lot of these things in regards to myself. I feel like I'm frequently at a crossroads with what I want to do with my energy in my life. And, as I've gotten older, creative endeavors feel a bit more like a charity to others, to the world, and perhaps to the ideal of myself than something intrinsically enjoyable. And, whether or not I or you or anyone think it's worth it or not, the truth is that nothing else gets to that end point. Whatever Shu and Yama B had to do, whatever they had to wrestle about, whatever they had to grind, whatever they had to argue about to make early Gulnarius so awesome, that was necessary. No one else has created early Gulnarius. Even if you're an expert on power metal, even if you hate their sound, you know that they're the ones to do what they did. They made that early Gulnarius sound because they were early Gulnarius. And that's the dilemma you have in life, man, is that you have the power to make things that would not exist otherwise. And so when we do the cost-benefit analysis, there's the cost of what it takes to do something or to create something great. And then there's what you or other people get at the end. That's what we traditionally consider. The cost of what it takes to make, and then the benefit that we get from making it. But we also have to weigh the potential cost of not doing it, right? What is that? What is the cost of never taking on the burden of the challenges involved in bringing your visions to life? Because sure, it might just suck to have to bring your visions to life. And that's true, but is it a better way to suck than feeling the suck of your visions not existing because you didn't make them? Because they just might not exist if you don't make them. If I don't make my Discord server vote each other out until only one person remains, then who will? Who else is going to do that? And even if someone else did decide to do it, it's going to be some other community, it's going to be some different experience, a different number of people, it'll play out differently. It's going to be like a different power metal band. with this train of logic, the vision, it has to feel authentic to you. We shouldn't just do things solely because no one else will, right? We can't just be like, oh, well, no one else will do this, so I guess I have to do it, with just any random thing. It has to be something we really feel connected and passionate to. If there's an outcome that we like, and that outcome won't come unless we see to it ourselves, it might be worth doing. It might be worth trying to make real. So just like it's our job to create good news, we have to also be realistic about understanding our role in creating the world we want to see. Right? If there's stuff we want to have happen, sometimes a lot of it, like, we have to do it. And this is always a huge motivator for me, because I often find myself looking out into the world and into the culture and just feeling like, I don't say these words, but I guess the feeling is, I don't get this. I don't get the world. It doesn't seem like the world gets me, right? There's some mismatch. I see what our culture rewards, and I'm just surprised because it's so different from what I reward in my internal world. I have this clear memory, for some reason, of this one comment in particular. Someone commented on one of my first TF2 songs, I think, or maybe, I don't know, the emo one, something like this, and they said something along the lines of, "Hey man, great stuff. How about a TF2 Euro dance track next? I think it's time to lift up the vibe a bit, not be so down." And so on one hand, I get that comment, a TF2 Euro dance or a TF2 happy hardcore song, that's a great idea. I've thought about that a lot. I love that idea. And generally, I'm someone who wants to be a positive influence for people. I don't want to be a doomer, I try to create white pills, if you will. I try to create good news. I'm trying to. It's what I'm trying to aim for. But I found this comment really notable, because it made me realize why I do have a lot of negative emotion, a lot of disturbing themes or imagery in my videos, in my content. Why there's a lot of emo vibes. And it's really because that's what I feel is missing. I don't see that enough in our microcosm, in our subculture. That's why I want to put it out there, because I feel like no one else is. When I look into the world of TF2 YouTube content creators, everything's cheery, everything stays surfacey. Nobody wants to go super deep into the subjective experience of playing TF2. So a lot of the stuff I make is a response to what I feel is missing. I'm representing the repressed feelings of the TF2 YouTube psyche. I'm naturally drawn to express the shadow of this scene. And that's also what I like. That's why I like actual emo music as well. Because if you read the lyrics from a band like Mineral, to me those are really profound. They're really interesting lyrics. There's these themes about being overwhelmed with bittersweet feelings from tiny fragments of memories from your childhood, or it will be about the love from your family members and these small moments you shared with them and how important those moments were. It can be about feeling that your soul has been robbed and being in this lost desperation to heal. And I like it because it's not just glorified despair. You see glorified self-deprecation, glorified despair. You see that plenty in our culture. It has the stuff I don't see. It has praise and thanks for those who've touched our heart. Where's that in our top 40 narratives? And it's saying the things that might be embarrassing to admit, that might be cringe or something. It's that expression of the tiresome weight of actually wanting to heal but not knowing how, rather than just being proud that you're a fuck up. And all that stuff is so real and so great to me in their lyrics, because it's uncommon to what you're going to normally find being sung about in most songs in modern Western music, but even just in the modern rock music landscape. But so I also got to wonder, maybe if every song on the radio, and the radio, who the fuck listens to the radio? If every song that was popular had lyrics like Mineral, and that was what most people were into, I guess maybe I wouldn't find Mineral lyrics as good, right? Because if that was the status quo, I'd probably have some other opinion about, oh no, these kind of lyrics are good, Because a lot of what I feel is necessary and interesting and good creatively is a response to what's going on in our reality, in our culture. And so, everything I said here in this video, it's mostly because I found it interesting. And the reason I found it interesting is because I feel like a lot of these things that I'm talking about, I don't hear people talking about. And that's why I wanted to talk about them. You know, you already know what gets talked about. I do too. And that does vary somewhat from person to person. But we also all know what it feels like when we finally hear something that just cuts through all the noise and it makes us go, yo, I'm really glad I'm considering this. That's nice. Alright. It's been a while. Thanks for watching. You know where to find me.